Walk into any mega hardware retailer on the planet with a fistful of cash. Walk past the automatic doors, the fluorescent lights, the endless aisles of cheap injection-molded plastic packaging. Look down the power tool aisle, you will see walls of yellow, you will see shelves of teal, you will see racks of red. You can buy DeWalt, you can buy Makita, you can buy Milwaukee. But no matter how much money you pull from your wallet, no matter how much you are willing to spend, you cannot buy a Hilti. It is a paradox that defies every single law of modern consumer capitalism. This is a massive global juggernaut, a $6 billion empire that manufactures the most indestructible, highly engineered, heavy-duty tools on the face of the earth. Their name is spoken with utter reverence on every major commercial construction site, from the high-rise skyscrapers of New York to the subterranean subways of Tokyo. Yet they refuse to put a single rotary hammer on a retail shelf. Every other brand offshored to the lowest bidder, racing to the bottom to satisfy the weekend warrior market. Every other brand begged for prime end cap shelf space at Home Depot and Lowe's. Hilti went the other way. They bypassed a retail machine entirely. They operate completely outside the system, utilizing a private army of field engineers to lease, track, and manage direct fleets of tools for billion-dollar construction firms. This is the story of a towering industrial empire built in a tiny, landlocked alpine microstate. A company that conquered the global construction industry by doing the exact opposite of what should have worked. The year is 194-1. Sean Liechtenstein. If you look at a map of Europe, Liechtenstein is barely a speck of dirt. It is a tiny, freezing, landlocked sliver of alpine terrain wedged violently between the borders of Switzerland and Austria. It is not exactly the industrial heartland of the world. It is isolated. But it was here, in this quiet valley, that 26-year-old engineer Martin Hilti and his older brother Eugen opened a small, unassuming mechanical workshop. They called it Maschinenbau Hilti OHG. They were men who inherently understood the unforgiving laws of heavy machinery. Martin had trained in mechanical engineering and automotive design at the prestigious Wismar Engineering College. But in 1941, the world outside their valley did not need commercial innovation. The world was on fire. It needed weapons. To survive, the Hilti brothers threw themselves into the grim, brutal reality of the Second World War. They signed contracts with the German arms industry. They machined high-precision components for massive tank engines. They turned out intricate, deadly parts for projectile fuses, feeding the insatiable, violent hunger of heavy manufacturing titans like Maybach Motorenbau and Robert Bosch. It was a dark, heavy business built entirely on the mechanics of global destruction. And then, the war ended. By the winter of 1946, the factory was silent. The lucrative contracts were void. The massive war machine that had fed their assembly lines had been ground into radioactive dust and scrap metal. The Hilti brothers were left staring at an empty, freezing workshop, teetering on the absolute edge of bankruptcy. The desperation of those immediate post-war years was absolute. To keep the lights on, to keep the machines oiled and their families fed, the men who had once built the beating hearts of armored tanks were forced into sheer, humiliating survival mode. Martin Hilti signed desperate subcontracts to cast gray iron parts for the Swiss textile industry. They machined molds for egg cups. They built cigarette lighters out of scrap materials. They manufactured cheap pencil sharpeners. They even designed a bizarre, water-powered kitchen mixer called the Elo. It was an indignity. The cold, bitter metal of a pencil sharpener mold must have felt like a cruel, twisted joke to a brilliant engineer obsessed with power, torque, and industrial scale. He wasn't building a legacy, he was buying tomorrow's bread. But Martin Hilti swallowed his pride, because the math of survival is always merciless. But while he was scraping out a meager living with kitchen mixers, Martin was closely watching the world outside his alpine window. Post-war Europe was a bombed-out, shattered shell. Major cities like London, Berlin, and Warsaw had been reduced to endless mountains of jagged concrete and twisted steel rebar. The entire continent had to be rebuilt from the ground up. And rebuilding meant fastening. It meant driving millions of tons of heavy steel into millions of tons of cured concrete. At the time, the method for doing this was nothing short of barbaric. A worker would take a heavy iron star drill, grip it in a freezing, calloused hand, and swing a heavy sledgehammer. Clink, turn. Clink, turn. Every single strike sent a brutal, bone-shattering shockwave down the chisel, up the wrist, and deep into the elbow and shoulder joints. A single hole in cured masonry could take 20 minutes of back-breaking agony, filling the worker's lungs with a deadly cloud of razor-sharp silica dust. It was an era where men literally traded the physical cartilage in their joints for an hourly wage. Martin Hilti looked at this brutal, primitive reality, and he refused to accept it. In the late 1940s, Martin discovered an obscure, immature technology designed to set nails directly into concrete. He acquired the original designs and the patent rights. It was a crude, unpredictable concept, but Martin saw the ghost of a revolution hiding inside the primitive mechanism. He obsessed over the physics of the problem. He knew that human muscle was too slow, too fragile, and too easily broken to rebuild the modern world at the speed it required. He needed a mechanical force multiplier. In the early 1950s, the Hilti engineers worked relentlessly, battling misfires, jammed pistons, and the inherent danger of weaponizing gunpowder for commercial everyday use. The stakes were incredibly high. If the tool failed, it was a useless paperweight on the site. If it misfired unpredictably, it was a lethal weapon in the hands of a tradesman. In 1953, the company introduced the Perfix, a powder-actuated high-velocity fastener. It was a promising start. But the true monster, the machine that would permanently alter the trajectory of global construction, arrived in 1957. They called it the DX100. The DX100 was not just a tool. It was a masterpiece of controlled, engineered violence. It was the world's first truly functional, safe, powder-actuated fastening tool. Martin Hilti hadn't just built a better hammer, he had built a heavy-duty gun designed specifically for creation. The mechanics were brilliant in their absolute brutality. Instead of relying on human kinetic energy, the DX100 utilized a 270 caliber blank powder cartridge. A worker would load a specially hardened thick steel pin into the heavy cold steel muzzle of the tool. He would press the barrel square against a solid slab of 6,000 psi cured concrete. He would brace his shoulder, lean his physical body weight into the grip, and pull the trigger. In a fraction of a millisecond, the exploding gunpowder violently slammed a captive internal piston forward. The piston struck the head of the pin, driving it straight into the concrete with devastating, perfect precision. The physical consequence of this invention for the working man was nothing short of miraculous. The 20 minutes of lung-choking, joint-destroying labor with a sledgehammer was entirely eradicated. It was reduced to a single second. The worker simply wiped away a wisp of gray smoke from the barrel, leaving a permanent, immovable anchor securely embedded in the wall. The tool absorbed the violent kinetic shock. The heavy steel housing, perfectly balanced and meticulously machined, took the sheer punishment so the worker's wrists and elbows didn't have to. The DX100 had a distinct soul. It was cold, heavy, and demanded absolute respect from the operator, but it was a savior to the men in the mud. It meant going home at the end of a grueling 14-hour shift without hands that uncontrollably shook and ached. It meant a framing crew could accomplish in 3 hours what used to take 3 agonizing weeks. It was a massive triumph of high-level mechanical engineering applied directly to the alleviation of human suffering. The momentum of the DX100 was absolutely terrifying. It swept across the industrial job sites of Europe like wildfire. By 1962, the tiny, desperate workshop from Liechtenstein was operating in 30 different countries. In 1963, Hilti was pulling in a staggering global turnover of over 400 million Swiss francs. But tragedy strikes at the height of victory. In November 1964, Eugen Hilti, the brilliant operational organizer who had tirelessly kept the company alive through its darkest post-war days, died suddenly at the age of 53. Martin was left alone at the helm of the massive ship, but the empire was already in unstoppable motion. In 1967, Hilti delivered the definitive killing blow to the old, painful ways of working. They introduced the TEA-17. It was the world's first truly electro-pneumatic rotary hammer drill. Before the TE-17, drilling deep into concrete meant relying on a mechanical cam system. These older drills used a crude, violently rattling gear system that physically slammed the chuck back and forth. It was brutal. The tool practically shook itself to pieces, and it shook the user's hands to pieces along with it, causing permanent nerve damage. Hilti's engineering team stripped away the violent mechanical cams. Instead, the TE-17 used an internal flying piston driven by compressed air. This pneumatic cushion smashed the striker into the drill bit with devastating impact energy, while radically reducing the violent vibration felt in the user's hands. It was an absolute engineering marvel, housed in a brutally tough casing. And it arrived on job sites in something entirely new, a distinctive blood-red toolbox. That red box rapidly became a profound cultural symbol in the gritty world of heavy construction. It was a loud statement of intent. If a concrete crew rolled up to a massive job site carrying those red Hilti boxes, you knew they were deadly serious. But the true overarching genius of the Hilti empire wasn't just the pneumatic piston or the .27 caliber cartridge. It was Martin Hilti's absolute stubborn refusal to let a middleman touch his tools. He realized that putting a beautiful TE-17 on a generic hardware store shelf next to a cheap inferior drill was an insult to his engineering. So, Hilti built a massive private army. They pioneered a direct sales model that bypassed retail entirely. Men in bright red trucks bypassed the supply houses and drove directly onto the freezing mud of the active job site. They didn't wear tailored suits. They wore heavy work boots. They smelled of diesel exhaust and cutting oil. They didn't wait in comfortable boardrooms. They walked out onto the dangerous rebar grids and handed the heavy, vibrating drills directly to the ironworkers. They spoke the native language of the trade. By 1971, Hilti's global turnover hit 376 million Swiss francs. They opened massive, sprawling production facilities in Thüringen, Austria, and Kaufering, Germany. They expanded into Tulsa, Oklahoma. Their tools built the massive autobahns. They anchored the heavy steel in the towering skyscrapers of Manhattan. They became the unspoken, heavily embedded infrastructure of the modern skyline. They were completely unstoppable. But no empire is truly immortal. And by the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Hilti Group found itself staring down the barrel of a terrifying existential crisis. The entire global landscape of power tools had fundamentally shifted. The rapid rise of cheap, globalized offshore manufacturing triggered a massive race to the bottom. Lithium-ion battery technology advanced, and suddenly, injection-molded plastics flooded the big-box hardware stores. The market was completely saturated with cheap, brightly colored, disposable tools that looked good on a shelf but possessed zero industrial soul. This wasn't just a simple loss of market share, it was a direct, fatal threat to Martin Hilti's original, uncompromising promise. The massive construction industry had corporatized. The men making the million-dollar purchasing decisions were no longer the grizzled, experienced foremen with calloused hands. They were fresh MBAs and corporate procurement officers sitting in sterile, air-conditioned trailers, staring at massive Excel spreadsheets. A procurement officer looks at a financial ledger. On one line, he sees a heavy-duty Hilti rotary hammer for $1,500. On the very next line, he sees a plastic big-box brand competitor for $300. The corporate math is utterly merciless. To the accountant, a drill is just a drill. Why on earth would the company pay 5 times the price just for a heavy red box? Hilti was bleeding out. They were backed into a corner and faced with a catastrophic, brand-killing choice. Do they compromise the legendary engineering, use cheaper base materials, and sell out to the big-box retailers to finally compete on price? Or do they aggressively maintain their uncompromising quality and risk pricing themselves into absolute extinction? They chose a third path. A path of absolute, staggering arrogance and brilliant business innovation. In 2001, Hilti launched Fleet Management. They realized a profound truth. Modern commercial contractors weren't actually buying tools. They were buying uptime. On a massive, highly coordinated commercial site, a broken tool is not a minor nuisance. It is a fatal schedule risk. If a concrete crew is delayed by 2 hours because a cheap hammer drill burns out, the cascade effect across the other trades costs $10,000 in lost labor and blown deadlines. So Hilti looked at the construction industry and said, "Stop buying our tools." They boldly transitioned from a traditional manufacturer to a tool-as-a-service provider. Instead of selling a single $1,500 drill, Hilti offered to strictly manage the entire site's tool fleet for a flat, predictable monthly fee. It was a masterstroke of corporate warfare. If a Hilti tool violently broke on a Tuesday afternoon, the contractor didn't have to box it up, ship it off to a service center, and wait 3 weeks for a bloated repair quote. A Hilti field engineer simply walked onto the site on Wednesday morning and handed them a brand new, fully serviced unit. No downtime, no hidden repair costs, no massive capital expenditures draining the contractor's bank account. Tools were labeled with exact tracking information, eliminating theft and hoarding. They didn't just protect the concrete anchor, they actively protected the foreman's schedule. Today, Hilti has over 1,000 tools under active contract worldwide. They completely insulated themselves from the cheap plastic knockoffs by proving that reliability is infinitely more valuable than a low sticker price. They refused to compromise the metal, and in doing so, they completely saved the soul of the company. Today, the Hilti Group operates in over 120 countries, employing 15,000 dedicated team members, generating over $6 billion annually. They have outlasted the brutal global recessions, the catastrophic supply chain collapses, and the endless race-to-the-bottom retail wars. But the true, enduring legacy of this empire cannot be found on a corporate balance sheet. It is found down in the dirt. Picture a modern heavy job site. It is 5:30 a.m., the morning air is freezing. The massive diesel-powered floodlights loudly click on, illuminating a cavernous, half-finished concrete tunnel deep beneath the gridlocked streets of a sleeping megacity. A 50-year-old foreman slowly walks to the back of his heavy-duty work truck. His hands are scarred, his joints aching from 30 years of hard, unforgiving labor. He reaches right past the cheap, disposable plastic gear and grabs a scuffed, deeply scratched, impact-resistant, violently red plastic box. He snaps the heavy metal latches open. The deeply familiar smell of ozone, heavy grease, and metallic dust hits the cold air. He pulls out a heavy rotary hammer. The rugged housing is cast magnesium and glass fiber reinforced plastic. It weighs heavy in his hand, perfectly balanced, and utterly devoid of compromise. It is a massive machine that absolutely commands respect. Martin Hilti died in 1997. His brother Eugen passed away decades before him in 1964. They did not live to see the sprawling, digitized, multi-billion-dollar global empire their little desperate machine shop would eventually become. But their names are cast directly into the hardened steel of that tool. It represents a direct, unbroken bloodline from a freezing, desperate alpine workshop making pencil sharpeners to the very structural foundation of the modern skyline. Trust is not built in a boardroom. It is not bought with prime retail shelf space or cheap plastic molds.